Reid's mornings at the research station were usually a quiet, predictable hum. The sterile white walls of his office, the faint, recycled air, the rhythmic click of keyboards from his colleagues, these were the constants of his controlled existence. He spent his days sifting through geological data, mapping seismic patterns, a meticulous dance of logic and reason. His world was built on quantifiable facts, on observable phenomena. He liked it that way. It was safe. This particular Tuesday, however, the hum felt off-key. A peculiar stillness hung in the air, a premonition he couldn't shake, like the oppressive calm before a storm. He had been hunched over a series of anomalous subsurface readings, a nagging discrepancy in an otherwise flawless data set. When the administrative assistant, a woman whose movements were usually as precise as a pendulum, approached his desk with an uncharacteristic hesitancy. "Reid," he began, his voice softer than usual, "there's a package for you. From an estate administrator. Urgent." She placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on his polished desk, its formal weight feeling strangely out of place amidst his technical schematics. He barely knew anyone who'd use such stationery. He thanked her, his brow furrowing as he picked up the envelope. The return address listed a small, unfamiliar town nestled deep in the northern wilderness, a place he'd only ever seen on topographical maps. Inside, a letter, crisp and formal, informed him of the unexpected passing of a distant relative, a great-aunt named Elara Vance, a name that sparked only the faintest flicker of recognition. He'd met her once, perhaps, at a family gathering decades ago, a fleeting image of a woman with sharp, knowing eyes. The letter went on to explain that, as her closest living relative, he was the sole inheritor of her estate. And the estate, it turned out, consisted of a single, isolated cabin. A cabin. Deep in a forgotten forest. The words resonated with a strange, dissonant chord in his mind. The letter hinted at the cabin's age, its seclusion, and vaguely referenced local folklore about its origins, a property said to be built on ancient ground. Reid dismissed the latter as quaint superstition, a byproduct of rural isolation. He was a man of science, after all. Yet, a sliver of curiosity, sharp and insistent, pierced through his logical defenses. Why him? Why this cabin? The great-aunt's death was described as sudden and without clear cause, a phrase that felt deliberately evasive. For days, the letter lay on his desk, a stark counterpoint to the orderly chaos of his work. He researched Elara Vance, finding little beyond a sparse online obituary and a few property records. The cabin itself was barely visible on satellite imagery, a dark smudge swallowed by an impenetrable canopy of ancient trees. The more he learned, the more a determined resolve began to solidify within him. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a mystery. And Reid, for all his logical inclinations, found himself drawn to unsolved puzzles. He needed to see it, to understand. He booked leave, packed a bag with practical essentials, and set out. The drive was long, an odyssey away from the structured grid of city streets and into a landscape that grew progressively wilder. The highway eventually thinned into a winding county road, then narrowed further into a gravel track barely wide enough for his vehicle. The asphalt cracked and vanished, replaced by packed dirt and loose stone. The trees, initially distant sentinels, began to press in, their branches weaving a dense, emerald tunnel overhead. Sunlight became a scarce commodity, dappling through the leaves in fleeting, ghostly patches. The air shifted, growing cooler, thicker, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, metallic tang he couldn't quite place. His phone signal died a few miles back, severing his last connection to the world he knew. He was truly alone. A sense of profound isolation began to settle over him, not just physical, but psychological. It was as if the forest itself was exhaling, pushing him deeper into its ancient lungs. The unease, which had been a low thrum since receiving the letter, now began to amplify. His logical mind insisted it was merely the effect of unfamiliar surroundings, the natural human response to solitude. Finally, the track opened into a small, overgrown clearing. And there it stood. The cabin wasn't quaint. It seemed less built into the forest and more grown from it, an organic extension of the ancient wood. A thin, almost imperceptible haze seemed to cling to its warped walls, shimmering faintly in the twilight. The air here felt different, heavy and still, as if it had been holding its breath for decades. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the ground beneath his feet, or perhaps it was just his imagination. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was absolute, suffocating. The forest around the cabin didn't hum with life, it merely waited. He stepped out of the vehicle, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots. He walked towards the front door, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron latch. He pushed. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. He hesitated on the threshold, a primal apprehension seizing him. This was more than just an old cabin. This place felt wrong. And he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that his journey had only just begun. The predictable hum of the research station, a sterile lullaby Reid had grown accustomed to, faded with each mile he put between himself and its antiseptic walls. The thought of the precise, measured world he was leaving behind felt strangely distant, a discarded skin. He drove deeper into the forest, the paved road giving way to gravel, then to a track barely wider than his vehicle. The canopy above thickened, swallowing the afternoon light, casting the path into a perpetual twilight. This was a different kind of quiet, not the muted silence of a controlled environment, but a vast, breathing stillness that felt ancient and watchful. The cabin appeared suddenly, a dark, angular silhouette against the dense wall of trees. It was larger than he remembered from the old photographs, its timbers weathered to a deep, solemn gray. A crooked chimney leaned precariously, and the porch sagged with age. He parked, the crunch of the tires on the overgrown drive sounding like an intrusion. This place felt less like an inheritance and more like an obligation, a heavy mantle settling onto his shoulders. Motes of dust danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. He set his duffel bag down in what he assumed was the main living area, a large room dominated by a stone fireplace. He ran a hand over the mantelpiece, the rough wood cool beneath his fingers. He had come here to clear out a relative's belongings, to process a legacy he barely understood, but already the cabin felt like it was doing the processing. He spent the first few hours methodically opening windows, letting the crisp forest air attempt to purge the stale interior. He swept away cobwebs, uncovered shrouded furniture, and generally tried to impose some order on the decades of neglect. The physical labor was a welcome distraction, a way to anchor himself in the tangible present. As dusk began to bleed into the forest, painting the windows in hues of bruised purple, he decided to tackle the small kitchen. He found a rusty kettle and, after a thorough scrubbing, filled it with bottled water. While he waited for the water to boil, a soft, deliberate creak sounded from the floorboards above him. He paused, kettle in hand. Just the house settling, he murmured aloud, the sound of his own voice echoing oddly in the quiet. He tried to pinpoint the source, but the cabin offered no further clues. He dismissed it, attributing it to the aging structure, the shifting timbers. Old houses made noise. This one, especially, must have 1,000 groans and sighs stored within. Its bones. Later, as he ate a simple meal of canned soup by the dim glow of a battery-powered lantern, he noticed something else. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, a wren, had been sitting on the mantelpiece earlier. He remembered seeing it there when he first walked in. He stared at it, then at the empty space on the mantel. Had he moved it himself, unthinkingly, while cleaning? He couldn't recall. He was tired, he reasoned, his mind playing tricks. He picked up the wren, its wood smooth and cool, and placed it back on the mantel. He even pushed it slightly into a corner, just to be sure. Reid lay on an air mattress, wrapped in a sleeping bag, listening. The forest outside was a black, murmuring presence. He heard the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, but then, distinct from the natural sounds, came a faint, rhythmic scratching. It seemed to come from the wall beside him, a soft, persistent scrape, like fingernails dragging lightly over wood. He held his breath, straining to hear. It stopped. He waited. A minute passed, then 2. Nothing. He exhaled slowly, telling himself it was just a branch brushing against the exterior, or perhaps a rodent. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to relax. But then, it started again. It wasn't words, not distinct sounds, just a breathy, drawn-out shish, like dry leaves being stirred by an unseen breeze, or something sighing close to his ear. He sat bolt upright, his heart thrumming against his ribs. The sound was too close, too internal. He flicked on his lantern, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating the rough-hewn log walls. He got up, his movements stiff, and walked slowly around the room, checking the windows, the corners. This was an old, isolated cabin, full of its own noises and eccentricities. It hadn't been on his initial cleanup list, but the faint, unsettling sounds had made him restless, driven him to action. With a grunt, he pulled it open. Inside, beneath layers of musty linen, lay a collection of what looked like family relics, a tarnished silver locket, a small, intricate compass with a needle stuck pointing north, and a thick, leather-bound book. He lifted the book. Its cover was worn smooth, the leather cracked along the spine. There was no title, only a single, stylized symbol pressed into the front, an interlocking knot, impossibly complex, like roots twisting around themselves. He opened it carefully. The pages were brittle, filled with spidery, faded script. It wasn't a standard journal, not a diary of daily events. The entries were sparse, often cryptic, interspersed with odd drawings and symbols that mirrored the one on the cover. He recognized a few familiar names, his own family lineage scattered throughout the dense prose, names he'd only ever seen on a dusty family tree. One particular passage caught his eye, written in a hand that seemed to grow more frantic towards the end of the entry. The pact holds. The land demands its due. One generation pays for the last, and the forest remembers what the blood forgets. He closed the book slowly, the weight of it suddenly immense in his hands. This cabin wasn't just old, it was alive, and it seemed to be telling him a story, one he was only just beginning to read. The ancient tome lay closed on the rough-hewn table, its leather skin cool beneath Reid's palm. The silence that followed the book's soft thud was not a comfort, but a profound, suffocating weight. The seed of dread, once a prickle, had begun to sprout, sending fine, icy tendrils through his chest. He sat for a long time, listening. The house groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the familiar settling of old timber. This was a sustained, almost organic complaint, as if the very structure was under duress. A faint, sweetish smell, like bruised lilies and something metallic, drifted from the hallway, then receded. Reid rose, compelled to investigate, yet held back by an invisible hand. He stood frozen, the muscles in his jaw tight. That night, sleep was a battlefield. The floor above him creaked with a rhythmic, dragging cadence, like something heavy being pulled across the attic boards. He pulled the thick blanket tighter, his eyes darting. He told himself it was just the house settling, the wind, his imagination. He heard a soft tapping from the wall beside his head, insistent and precise, like tiny, dry knuckles. By morning, the phenomena had escalated beyond any rational explanation. He found his grandfather's old pipe, which he'd left on the mantelpiece, carefully placed on his pillow. The scent of stale tobacco, faint yet unmistakable, clung to the fabric. Later, while making coffee, the water in the kettle began to boil with an unnatural vigor, spitting steam even before he'd turned on the burner. He stared at it, the brass gleaming, the water roiling. The cabin wasn't just old, it was active. And it was responding to him. Reid knew he couldn't stay there, not without answers. The determination that had been a quiet hum in his periphery now roared to life. Inside, the air was cool and still, thick with the scent of aged paper and dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. A single, elderly archivist with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a ledger, his gaze slow and appraising. Reid explained his purpose, vaguely, about inheriting the cabin and wanting to learn more about its history. The archivist, a man named Bartholomew, nodded, his fingers already sifting through the card catalog. He directed Reid to a dim corner, where stacks of brittle newspapers and bound volumes of local histories waited. Hours blurred into a methodical search. Reid pored over faded deeds, tax records, and census documents. He traced the ownership of the land back through generations, noting the consistent presence of his family name, or variations of it, tied to the property. The cabin itself, it seemed, was centuries old, its foundations laid long before the town itself was properly established. He found oblique references in old newspaper clippings, unexplained disappearances near the old Weatherwood property, dating back to the late 1800s. A short article from the 1930s mentioned peculiar occurrences reported by a previous occupant, though it offered no details, ending abruptly. There was a brief mention of a local elder in the 1960s who spoke of old ways and the land's demands in connection to the Weatherwood lineage, dismissed by the reporter as quaint superstition. Then, he found it. Tucked within a crumbling parish register from the early 1700s, a barely legible entry detailed the original land grant. The words hummed with an ominous significance, echoing the unsettling sensation of the cabin itself. He flipped through more pages, his heart thrumming with a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found another, later entry, a baptismal record from 1752, for a child of his distant ancestor. Again, in the margin, the same unsettling script, though fainter this time, the pact holds. His ancestor. The land. A debt. A pact. This was a legacy, a burden. They were consequences. He closed the heavy volume, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams suddenly feeling like a swarm of unseen eyes. The truth, whatever it was far more sinister than he had dared to imagine. The implication had settled over Reid like a shroud woven from cold dread. A legacy. A burden. Not just an old cabin, but a debt, a pact, a living entity tied to the very earth beneath the floorboards. The whispering, the wren, the boiling kettle, they were not random acts. They were demands. He needed answers, concrete ones, something more than fragmented thoughts and unsettling sensations. His research began crudely, online searches yielding little more than local ghost stories and vague historical mentions of the area's early settlers. The forest was too vast, too forgotten for easy digital trails. His gaze fell upon a crumpled leaflet he'd found tucked into a drawer in the cabin's study, advertising a small, privately funded research station dedicated to the study of regional flora, fauna, and geological anomalies. It was miles deeper into the wilderness, a place few would ever stumble upon. It felt like a magnet, pulling him, or perhaps pushing him, towards an inevitable truth. The drive was long, the gravel road narrowing to little more than a dirt track swallowed by the encroaching forest. He felt the weight of the forest pressing in, the trees like silent, watchful sentinels. Finally, a break in the trees revealed a clearing. The research station was a low-slung, utilitarian building of weathered timber and corrugated metal, looking less like a hub of scientific inquiry and more like an abandoned logging outpost. A single, flickering fluorescent tube hummed above a warped wooden door. Rust stained the metal siding, and overgrown vines clawed at the window frames. Inside, the air was cool and stale, heavy with the smell of old paper, dust, and something faintly chemical, like formaldehyde. Rows of metal shelving, crammed with unlabeled boxes and ancient binders, lined the narrow corridors. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic drip of water and the low thrum of ancient ventilation. The figure startled, dropping a small vial. It clattered but didn't break. Good heavens! Didn't hear you come in, the archivist said, turning. Their eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, held a weary, almost haunted quality. We don't get many visitors out here. The archivist listened, their expression unreadable, occasionally nodding slowly. Alarm? Crossed their face. The old legends, the archivist murmured, their gaze drifting towards a particularly dusty section of shelving. There are stories, of course. Always are, in places like this. But you're not looking for ghost stories, are you? You're looking for. But some of the early researchers. They were a different breed. Less concerned with pure science, more with observation. Unfiltered observation. The archivist pulled a heavy, leather-bound ledger from a shelf, its spine cracked, its pages yellowed and brittle. This belonged to the first head of this station, nearly a century ago. He was fascinated by the anomalies of this particular tract of forest. The unusual growth patterns, the soil composition, and the local folklore. Reid took the ledger, its weight surprising. The cover was cool and rough beneath his fingers. He opened it carefully, the brittle pages rustling like dry leaves. The handwriting inside was spidery, precise, but grew increasingly frantic in later entries. He scanned entries detailing unusual seismic readings, accelerated decay rates in certain areas, and strange bioluminescence observed in the deepest parts of the woods. Then, his eyes snagged on a passage, dated October 1934. The elders of the old settlement, long since vanished, spoke not of spirits, but of the land itself. A consciousness, ancient and hungry. They called it the root heart. They believed it demanded sustenance, offerings. A pact was made, generations ago, between the original settlers and the root heart, to ensure prosperity, to keep the forest from reclaiming them entirely. A dark bargain, whispered to be sealed with blood and lineage. They spoke of the first offering, and the subsequent tithe of kin. Each generation, a life, bound to the land, to feed its hunger, to maintain the balance. Reid's breath hitched. He read on, his gaze devouring the words. My initial skepticism has eroded. The patterns are too distinct. The disappearances, the unseasonable blights, the sudden, inexplicable surges of vitality in specific flora. It's all tied. The root heart is not a metaphor. It is real. It demands. And when its due is not met, it reaches. It takes. Reid believed the cabin, built upon what the elders called the nexus, is not merely on sacred ground, but of it. A conduit. A focal point for the root heart's influence. The family who built it. They were the keepers of the pact. And now, Reid fear, the pact is breaking. Or perhaps, merely shifting. Hands. The ledger fell open to a final entry, scrawled almost illegibly, dated just days before the researcher's own disappearance, noted in a later, official addendum. It knows Reid C. It is here. In the walls. In the earth. It is calling. They are not in my mind. They are from the earth itself. It is hungry. And the lineage. The bloodline. It remembers. The air in the small room felt suddenly heavy, thick, and suffocating. The cabin, his inheritance, wasn't just built on an ancient burial ground, it was a living, breathing part of an entity, a nexus for something that demanded sacrifice, a pact made generations ago, with his own bloodline. The entity wasn't just in the land, it was the land, and it remembered. It remembered the debt. It remembered him. And the entity was already collecting. The terrible weight of the archivist's words clung to Reid, a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. A legacy of horror. The phrase echoed in his skull, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile walls of his composure. He was not merely an inheritor of property, he was an inheritor of a damnation, a pact woven into the very fabric of his bloodline. The drive back to the cabin was a blur of shifting greens and browns, the familiar forest now a tunnel of watching eyes, each branch a skeletal finger, each rustle of leaves a whispered warning. He felt a profound, unsettling clarity. The cabin was not just a place, it was a hunger. The cabin swallowed the last vestiges of daylight, plunging the interior into a premature twilight. He needed to think, to process, to find an anchor in the maelstrom of what he now knew. The air around him shimmered, an optical illusion, or perhaps something more. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them. It clung to the back of his throat, acrid and suffocating. Reid pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for an old acquaintance, a historical cartographer named Elias, who worked at a remote research station specializing in forgotten regional histories and land surveys. Elias might have access to obscure records, maps, anything that could shed more light on the true age of the cabin, the family's presence here, or even local folklore that wasn't filtered through fear. He needed an outside perspective, a voice of reason. But the screen flickered, then died. Not just the signal, but the entire device. He pressed the power button repeatedly, then tried the charger, but the phone remained stubbornly inert, a dead slab of plastic and glass. He tried his laptop, then a small battery-powered radio he'd brought for emergencies. Each device failed in turn, not just losing signal, but powering down, their internal mechanisms suddenly lifeless. It wasn't a signal jam, it was a localized, absolute negation of technology. The cabin was severing his connections. A low hum began, a vibration that resonated not just in the floorboards beneath his feet, but deep within his chest cavity. Reid's gaze swept the room, his jaw tight. Nothing moved. Nothing was visible. Yet the pressure mounted, and the coppery smell intensified, making his stomach churn. He walked to the window, the glass now appearing milky, opaque, as if a fine, oily film had coated it from the inside. He pressed his palm against it, but the surface was dry, smooth, and strangely warm. He tried another window, then another. All were the same. The cabin had become a blind box, sealed off from the world outside. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The hum intensified, throbbing now, and the air grew heavy, like breathing underwater. He could feel it, a presence, not just watching, but pressing against him, an invisible weight. It wanted him to know its power. Then, from the corner of his eye, a movement. It was too vague to be a person, too fluid to be an object, but it was there, a ripple in the fabric of reality. He would not cower. He walked towards the anomaly, his footsteps heavy against the groaning floorboards. He stopped inches from the chest. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through his bones. And then he saw it. It was intricate, disturbing, a knot of intertwining lines that resembled both a gnarled tree root and a skeletal hand, clutching at a stylized, weeping eye. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a sickly green glow that was barely perceptible but undeniably present. This wasn't just old carving, it felt alive, malevolent. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a sound that conveyed a singular, terrifying message, mine. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a place built on a burial ground, the cabin itself, and perhaps this very chest, was intrinsically tied to the pact, a focal point, a living conduit for the entity. He was in its grip, completely. The revelation had sunk its teeth into Reid, not merely as a thought, but as a visceral certainty. The cabin wasn't just a place on the burial ground, it was the thing itself, or at least its heart, a living conduit, pulsating with an ancient, malevolent will. He wasn't simply trapped in the cabin was the trap, a monstrous organism he had unwittingly inherited. A cold, hard resolve solidified in his gut, overriding the creeping paralysis of dread. He had to get out. Now. He scrambled, a frantic blur of motion, snatching his worn backpack from the floor, stuffing a few energy bars, a water bottle, and his old compass inside. His fingers fumbled with the clasp, stiff with a terror that clawed at his throat. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy, pressing in on him. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the timbers, sounded like a watchful breath. It wouldn't budge. He twisted, pulled, then threw his shoulder against the weathered wood, grunting with effort. Nothing. It was as if the very fibers of the cabin had fused, solidified into an impenetrable barrier. He spun, desperation making his movements jerky, and targeted a window. Without a second thought, Reid clambered through, scraping his arm on the rough wood, the sharp sting a welcome distraction from the clammy grip of fear. He hit the damp earth running, not looking back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The familiar path he had taken just days ago seemed to writhe and shift underfoot. Trees, once steadfast sentinels, now appeared to lean in, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. He pushed deeper, his compass clutched in a sweaty palm. North. Suddenly, the path vanished. One moment, firm earth and scattered pine needles, the next, a dense wall of thorny brambles and gnarled roots, impossibly thick, impossibly green. Panic flared, hot and sharp. He stumbled, catching himself on a moss-covered trunk that felt strangely slick, almost slimy, beneath his touch. He pressed on, forcing his way through the undergrowth, his clothes snagging, his skin tearing. The forest canopy above grew denser, swallowing the meager daylight, plunging him into a perpetual twilight. He heard a low, guttural thrumming, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his bones, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the wind. It was something deeper, something ancient. He fought against a growing sense of disorientation. He was sure he was heading north, but the sun, when it occasionally pierced the canopy, seemed to be in the wrong place. The compass needle spun wildly, then settled, pointing stubbornly southwest, back towards the cabin. He shook it, tapped it, but it remained fixed, mocking him. His mind, already frayed, began to unravel at the edges. Was he lost? Or was the forest actively misleading him? A flash of movement caught his eye, deeper within the deepening gloom. Not an animal, but a shape, vaguely humanoid, flickering between the ancient trees. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Reveal/discovery, a clearing, not a natural one, had opened before him. In its center stood a colossal oak, its bark a tapestry of deep furrows and ridges. Not graffiti, but deep, precise grooves, forming symbols he now recognized. They were the same. Intricate and unsettling, spiraling upwards, not just on the oak, but on the surrounding trees, too. The entire clearing was ringed with them, a silent, powerful language etched into the living wood. This wasn't just a burial ground, not just a cabin built on it. The realization choked him. He was not merely lost, he was imprisoned by the very landscape. The research station became a desperate mirage, a cruel joke. He staggered backward, tripping over a root, falling hard onto the damp ground. He was exhausted, scratched, bruised, and utterly broken. The research station was unreachable, a fantasy. He was going in circles, always, inevitably, being herded. He could feel the insidious pull, a magnetic force guiding him. He wasn't choosing his direction anymore. The forest was choosing for him. He had run for hours, but somehow, impossibly, he was back. The shattered window gaped like a hungry mouth. He stumbled towards it, no longer fighting, merely obeying. He crawled back through the jagged opening, collapsing onto the dusty floorboards. The air inside felt heavy, stagnant, yet strangely, horrifyingly, familiar. He was back in his cage. And the cabin, no longer just a place, but a conscious, ancient entity, seemed to hum with a quiet, triumphant satisfaction. He was trapped. utterly, irrevocably trapped. The cabin's timbers had become a living cage, the air a thick, pulsing membrane that threatened to suffocate him with every breath. Reid knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that he couldn't stay. The entity wasn't merely present in the cabin, it was the cabin, its ancient will coursing through the very wood and stone. A tattered, leather-bound journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's study, had provided a desperate lead. The scribbled, frantic entries of a long-dead relative detailed a remote research station, a forgotten outpost established by his ancestor, the original architect of this nightmare. The journal spoke of observations, anomalies, and a binding ritual that had gone terribly wrong. It was a thread, fragile and fraying, but Reid clung to it like a drowning man to driftwood. He found the research station tucked away on a forgotten logging road, miles deeper into the wilderness than any map dared to chart. It was less a building, more a collection of corrugated metal structures and prefabricated units, swallowed by decades of encroaching foliage. Rust bled down the walls, and broken windows gaped like empty eyes. A heavy, steel door, half off its hinges, groaned a protest as he pushed it open. The hum of ancient, failing electrical systems vibrated faintly beneath his feet. Dust motes, thick as fog, danced in the weak light, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight. He moved through abandoned labs, their benches littered with desiccated samples and shattered beakers, the ghosts of experiments long concluded. He followed the directions scrawled in the journal, navigating through a maze of identical corridors until he reached a reinforced door marked Archives, Level 3. The padlock, surprisingly, was still intact, but rusted to brittleness. A swift kick shattered it, and the door swung inward with a shriek of tortured metal. The archive was a cavernous space, rows of steel shelving disappearing into the gloom. The smell here was different, not just dust and decay, but the metallic tang of old paper, the faint, acrid scent of chemicals, and something else, something musty and profound, like ancient secrets breathing. This was it. This was where the answers lay buried. His eyes scanned for anything that resembled a personal account, anything that would detail the binding ritual mentioned in the journal. His hand brushed against a heavy, wooden chest, tucked away on a lower shelf, distinct from the uniform metal boxes. He pried open the lid. And beside it, a series of thick, bound ledgers, their covers tooled with the same arcane symbols. These were not mere scientific observations. He pulled out the topmost ledger. The handwriting was neat, meticulous, but the content quickly devolved into madness. It was his ancestor's account, detailing the initial discovery of the ancient burial ground, the sheer power radiating from it. The ancestor, a man of ambition and scientific curiosity, had sought to tap into this primal energy, believing he could harness it for his own ends. The entity was not merely on the land, it was the land, or rather, the concentrated, primal consciousness of the forest itself, a being of immense, ancient hunger. It had existed for millennia, nourished by the slow decay of life, the cycle of death and rebirth in the forgotten woods. But his ancestor, in his arrogance, had disturbed its slumber, sought to bind it, to force it into a pact. The binding ritual wasn't a containment spell, it was an offering, a desperate bargain. To prevent the entity from consuming everything in its path, to secure a sliver of its power, the ancestor had promised it a continuous, generational tribute. Not just any tribute. A blood sacrifice. The cabin, Reid now understood, was the focal point, the altar, the conduit through which this gruesome transaction took place. Reid fumbled for his flashlight, its beam a feeble defense against the encroaching black. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick with a scent he now recognized as decay, but also something sweet, cloying, like overripe fruit and iron. He shone his light back to the page. The last entries were smeared, frantic. It demands the essence, not merely the flesh. A slow absorption. The soul itself. To prevent the unbinding. The ultimate hunger. Reid's distant relative, the one whose death had brought him here, had been the last offering. His sudden, mysterious demise wasn't an accident, or a random act of violence. It was the entity collecting its due. And now, Reid was next. He wasn't just living in the cabin, he was being prepared. Reid backed away, the ledger clutched tight. The sacrifice wasn't merely dying. It was a complete dissolution of self, a profound, agonizing erasure. The ancestor had sought to control a god, and instead, had condemned his descendants to become its sustenance. The final page of the ledger, written in a different hand, a more recent one, perhaps the detectives or another investigators, detailed a desperate, unverified theory. To sever the pact, the lineage must be broken. Not through death, but through denial. A refusal of the offering, a sacrifice of a different kind. One that starves the hunger, rather than feeds it. A complete and utter rejection of the bloodline's claim, not on the land, but on life itself. The meaning hammered into Reid with the force of a physical blow. The only way to stop the entity, to truly break the cycle, was not to offer himself, but to cut the cord entirely. To make a sacrifice that transcended death, a sacrifice that would ensure no one else would ever be bound to this horror. But what did that truly mean? And how could he achieve it without being devoured first? The air itself seemed to press in, thick and suffocating, as if the entity had extended its hungry maw into the very heart of the research station, ready to claim its next meal. The revelation had scorched itself into Reid's mind, leaving no room for doubt or retreat. He understood now. The pact wasn't a simple exchange of life for power, but a binding, a parasitic tether across generations. To break it, truly break it, meant severing the lineage's connection to this horror, ensuring no future generation would ever be dragged into its ravenous maw. The thought was a bitter, metallic taste on his tongue, but a desperate clarity pulsed beneath it. There was only one way. He moved with a grim purpose that morning, the first tendrils of dawn barely piercing the oppressive canopy above the cabin. His first stop wasn't back into the woods, but a detour, a necessary acquisition. The ancient texts in the cabin had hinted at it, obscure verses mentioning the unbound blood and the severing. It was a desperate gamble, but the only one left. The drive was a blur of gravel and straining engine. He arrived at the research station just as the sun began to warm the dew-soaked fields. It was an unassuming, concrete building, tucked away near a forgotten access road, a relic from a time when the forest's unique flora was a subject of academic curiosity. Inside, the air was cool and stale, smelling of dust and decaying paper. A lone, elderly archivist looked up from behind a towering stack of yellow journals, spectacles perched low on their nose. Reid explained his need for specific, historical documents pertaining to regional folklore and ancient burial practices, omitting the true urgency that gnawed at his gut. The archivist, surprisingly helpful, pointed him towards a dimly lit annex, a place where forgotten knowledge went to quietly crumble. Among the brittle pages and musty tomes, Reid found what he was looking for, a small, leather-bound volume, its spine cracked, its pages brittle with age. It spoke of old ways, of the binding of earth and spirit, and, crucially, of the unbinding. It detailed a ritual, not of sacrifice in the traditional sense, but of severance, a final, irreversible cutting of ties, a rerouting of the flow. It required a specific, potent catalyst, something that could only be found in the darkest, most ancient parts of the forest, and a vessel of ancestral significance. His mind immediately went to the cabin, to the very heart of the entity's hold. He clutched the book, its worn cover rough beneath his fingers, and made his exit, leaving the quiet archivist to their undisturbed world. The return journey was different. The forest seemed to lean in, its branches' skeletal fingers reaching, clawing. By the time he reached the dirt track leading to the cabin, the sun was a bruised purple stain on the horizon, swallowed by a sky that had turned an unnatural, bruised gray. The cabin itself was a nightmare made manifest. It no longer sat nestled amongst the trees, it loomed. The porch planks groaned, not under his weight, but under an unseen pressure, as if the very structure was straining, alive with a malevolent force. Reid pushed the front door open. The interior was a twisted parody of what he remembered. Furniture lay overturned, splintered. The walls seemed to ripple, the log construction warping and reforming, as if the wood itself was alive, struggling. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, hung from the rafters, dripping with an oily, black residue. A low, guttural thrum vibrated through the floorboards, resonating in his chest. He felt the entity's focus shift, a sudden, immense weight settling upon him, pressing down from every direction. Reid stood his ground, the leather-bound book clutched in one hand, a small, obsidian-bladed knife in the other. He had prepared. He had found the catalyst, a rare, black fungus that grew only in the deepest, lightless caves, said to absorb all spiritual energy around it. He had it now, crushed into a fine powder in a small, iron bowl. "This ends now," Reid said, his voice stronger this time, filled with a resolve that surprised even himself. No more. No more ancestors, no more descendants. A shriek, not of sound but of pure psychic agony, tore through Reid's mind, making his teeth ache, threatening to shatter his skull. He saw his own face among them, contorted, desperate. It was a psychological assault, a desperate attempt to break his will, to remind him of the overwhelming power he faced. He closed his eyes against the barrage, focusing on the ritual. He placed the iron bowl in the center of the room, exactly as described in the ancient text. The black powder within seemed to shimmer, absorbing the sickly green glow that permeated the room. Then, with a deep breath, he began to chant the words from the book, ancient syllables that felt alien on his tongue, yet flowed with an unsettling familiarity. As the words left his lips, the entity retaliated with full force. The cabin groaned, twisting violently. The ceiling beams cracked with explosive reports, showering him with splinters and dust. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his chest, as if a hook was being plunged into his heart, trying to rip it from his body. It wanted to consume him, just as it had consumed so many others. But Reid held firm. He dug the obsidian knife into his palm, a sharp, cleansing pain that grounded him. The book spoke of unbound blood as the ultimate severing agent. His blood, the final drop of the cursed lineage, would be the key. The moment his blood met the powder, a violent tremor shook the cabin. The green light intensified, then began to flicker, as if struggling against an unseen force. The entity was fighting, desperately, against the severing. It was a battle for existence, for its very connection to this world, and Reid was at the epicenter, pouring his will, his pain, his very essence into the desperate act of cutting the cord. The air crackled, thick with untold power, and Reid knew, with a horrifying certainty, that this was his last stand. The shriek wasn't a sound that vibrated the air, but a raw, tearing agony within Reid's own skull. Images, a torrent of them, not just his kin but faces he'd never seen, ancient visages twisted in identical terror, pulsed behind his eyes. Then, a sudden, absolute silence. His legs buckled. He didn't fall so much as his body ceased to hold itself upright, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards. The taste of copper filled his mouth, thick and metallic, and a hot stream traced a path from his nose, down his upper lip. He lay there, sprawled amidst the dust and splintered wood, his vision swimming. He pushed himself onto his elbows, the world tilting precariously. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a ghost of the psychic assault. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, as if he'd been wrestling with something impossibly strong, not just an unseen horror. He crawled, rather than walked, to the window. The forest outside was still, eerily so. The leaves hung motionless, no breeze stirred the branches. The air, though, felt cleaner, sharper. The cabin itself seemed different. The distorted wood grain on the walls, which had so often seemed to shift and contort into leering faces, was just wood, old and scarred. But the quiet. The sheer, absolute quiet was the most terrifying thing of all. It wasn't peaceful. He felt it in himself too. He tried to recall the faces that had flashed before him, the generations of his kin. They were there, somewhere, just beyond reach, like words on the tip of his tongue that refused to surface. The entity had recoiled, yes, but it had taken a piece of him with it. He didn't know what, exactly, but he felt its absence like a phantom limb. Days later, or perhaps weeks, time had blurred into an indistinct smear of exhaustion and disorientation. He found himself not in his cabin, but in a sterile, humming room. The air was cool, smelling faintly of antiseptic and something metallic, like ozone. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting an unforgiving glare on the pale walls. He was lying on a narrow cot, a thin blanket pulled up to his chin. His body felt heavy, sluggish, but the persistent ache in his head had dulled to a low thrum. A man in a plain, gray uniform, a technician, entered the room, carrying a small tray with a clear liquid in a glass. He didn't speak, just placed it on a nearby table and checked a few monitors attached to Reid's arm. Reid tried to ask where he was, what had happened, but his voice was a rasp, barely audible. The technician glanced at him, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before exiting again. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Snippets of hushed conversations reached him, disembodied voices from beyond the thin walls. Found him wandering. Incoherent. Near the old logging road. Completely inert now. But the energy signature. Residual resonance unlike anything we've mapped. The transfer was successful. Transfer? The word echoed in the cavern of his mind. What had transferred? What had been the cost? It had merely been displaced, its essence perhaps scattered, or worse. Found a new host. He pushed himself up, the cot groaning under his weight. He had to understand what transfer meant, what residual resonance implied. The entity hadn't been destroyed, it had simply retreated, leaving him scarred, incomplete, and burdened with a new, terrifying mystery. The world outside the cabin felt strangely muted, the forest air thin and sharp against his skin. He pressed his hand to his chest again, seeking the familiar thrum of his own vitality. The cold knot was still there, a hollow space where something intrinsic had once resided, now replaced by an absence that pulsed with its own quiet dread. He had won, hadn't he? The entity, or whatever it was, had receded. Yet, the victory tasted like ash. He had survived, but at a cost he couldn't yet quantify, only feel. A part of him had been peeled away, leaving a vulnerability he knew would never truly heal. It was a scar, deep and internal, a constant reminder of the unseen forces that had reshaped him. He turned his back on the cabin, not with relief, but with a strange sense of abandonment. He didn't lock the door. What would be the point? He walked, the crunch of pine needles underfoot the only sound. Days blurred. He wasn't sure how he navigated the winding, overgrown tracks, how he found his way out of the forgotten woods. His car, abandoned weeks ago, was a rusting hulk, but a nearby service road eventually led him to a small, isolated research station. It was a squat, concrete structure, half hidden by encroaching foliage, a relic from some bygone era of study into the forest's unique ecosystem. The windows were grimy, but unbroken. The lock on the main door yielded to a simple pry, a testament to its long disuse. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and mildewed paper. Rows of metal shelving held decaying field guides, outdated geological surveys, and notebooks filled with faded script. He found a small cot in a back room, a functional kitchen with a defunct refrigerator, and a single, flickering fluorescent light that hummed like a trapped insect. This was where he would try to piece himself back together, or at least understand what he had become. Here, it was sterile, an absence of sound rather than a presence of something watchful. It allowed his thoughts to unfurl, to confront the fragmented images and sensations that had been transferred to him during that final, terrible confrontation. He remembered the blinding light, the psychic scream, and the sudden, overwhelming rush of memories that weren't his own. He saw faces, generations of faces, each etched with a similar, haunted despair. The distant relative hadn't simply died. They had been consumed, their spirit providing the necessary fuel, the release, for the entity to continue its long, patient cycle. And Reid, by some twist of fate, by his presence, by his bloodline, had become the next link in that chain. The transfer hadn't been a defeat of the entity, but a recalibration, a re-anchoring. He spent days at the research station, poring over the dusty journals, not for answers to his specific predicament, but for any flicker of recognition, any hint of the ancient truths he now carried. He found nothing explicit, no mention of packs or entities, only dry scientific observations of unusual flora and fauna, and increasingly desperate, almost poetic entries about the forest's inexplicable pull, its breathing, its memory. The researchers, it seemed, had only skimmed the surface of the horror that lay beneath. They had tried to categorize the unclassifiable, to rationalize the irrational. He looked at his reflection, really looked. He ran a hand over his face, it felt thinner, the bones more pronounced. He was still Reid, but he was also something more, something less. He had escaped the cabin, yes. The immediate threat had passed. But the horror hadn't been vanquished. It had merely shifted, burrowed deeper, taken root within him. The ancient pact, the lineage of sacrifice, was no longer an external threat to be outrun. He was free, yet utterly bound. And the most unsettling implication of all was the quiet certainty that one day, the knot in his chest would awaken, and the cycle would demand its next payment.